Welcome to Inflection Points, a podcast about technology and big ideas from the office of the CTO at Extreme Networks. Dearest Tim, we're back again. How are you today?
I'm fantastic.
I disagree.
I have no response to that.
Your face is not fantastic.
Oh, wow. I was not prepared for that today, but I'm willing to challenge that hypothesis. I think my face is fantastic.
I'm kidding. Your face is fantastic, but I thought I would just jump us right into the topic of the day, which is, how do you challenge a hypothesis? Because your hypothesis was, I'm fantastic.
and challenge accepted.
Yeah, well, I think it's, aside from the fact that, yes, you are actually fantastic, I think, we've been really immersed in talking about the infinite enterprise and discussing, how this is going to come about. And, I think we've looked at it from every single angle. And, I think it's going to be, I think I'm on the verge of kind of being bought in. What do you think?
Well, that's the very moment I think it's important for us to start challenging some of those concepts. It's really important to be able to look at this from different perspectives and not just necessarily to live inside of our own experience here.
Even though that's the infinite enterprise.
Well, it is. But, one of the things that's great about the office of the CTO at Extreme is that we have not only the luxury, but the mandate to challenge ideas. So Nabil has asked us and challenged us to challenge those thoughts. When we're in meetings, when we're coming up with ideas, when we're trying to incubate opportunities, it's really incumbent on us to challenge those thoughts and not just sort of have this confirmation bias and this constant, belief that we in and of ourselves are right.
Oh, so I'm not supposed to buy everything you say?
No, by all means, please challenge me.
Oh, whoops.
But but one of the things that I find this important for me, at least in that kind of circumstance, is to challenge it with love, right? So you're never really challenging the person, you're challenging the ideas. So being able to have that conversation safely and knowing that the person who may be challenging the concept or challenging a thought that you've had is not coming after you, they're coming after, a different perspective. They're trying to draw out whether or not this is something that is worthwhile for us. And I think coming at the infinite enterprise in that way is really important. If we forget that there are other points of view, we're going to miss out on the important parts of what the infinite enterprise means to us.
Well, I mean, I guess what you're saying essentially is, within the office of the CTO, we have these ideas because I think we've talked about it before, but, outside of going out and sharing what's going on with us and what we're thinking, we also actually incubate ideas as well. So what you're saying is that we're required to red face test this.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is our chance. All right. We now have the opportunity to take a look at whether or not it stands up to scrutiny.
Oh, good. Well, then it's really good that we have brought on board one of our best contrarians within the office of the CTO. He is definitely known for always challenging ideas, but that's because he's very smart and he's very qualified at doing it. And we've brought on our colleague and good friend, Marcus Burton. And so I think Marcus is going to be really interesting today because what I like about Marcus is that he has a really interesting background and I connect with him because he has a background in liberal arts like I do as well. So he has his BA in psychology, theology, and literature, but he's also a certified wireless engineer. And I think that gives him a really interesting perspective on technology.
Yeah, that's a social and a technological perspective that we need for the infinite enterprise, because as we've talked about over the episodes, the infinite enterprise is also social. It's very interrelated with our society, not just our technology. So I think Marcus is a great person to talk about this. He and I joined the company near the same time. He's a little bit longer in tenure than I, but we've both had that same infinite enterprise experience where we haven't met one another in person. We've spent a lot of time together on video conference and on telephones.
Oh, so you're like Infinite Enterprise AOL edition.
You're bringing back my age here. Thank you very much. But yeah, Marcus and I have spent a lot of time working together, and I value his approach to challenging ideas. So I think he's going to have a lot to offer in this particular conversation.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm very excited to see what he has to say because, as you had said, we haven't really unpacked a lot of the social portions of the infinite enterprise, but it has been a consistent theme and thinking about how do we interact? How do we get that real person experience? And, can we actually do it? Is this going to be a thing?
So before we go deep on what challenges we have with the infinite enterprise, Carla, can you explain what is the infinite enterprise?
Sure. The infinite enterprise is, for all of our listeners out there, this hypothesis that we have that as we continue to be able to expand the network to provide enterprise grade connectivity. So the same connectivity that you get if you're in your school library or in your workplace, that kind of level of connectivity is going to disperse so that you can have the same experience, whether you're in the library or whether you are out in the middle of Idaho, just trying to connect from your laptop out in the great wild. So as a result of that, it means that you can go anywhere and you can have that experience anywhere, which leads to hyper individualism. So we are exploring, where does this take us? Where does this technology take us? And how are we responding to this because of the pandemic? And that is the infinite enterprise.
Fantastic. So I think that this is a great opportunity to bring in Marcus and get him to either poke holes or maybe even support what the hypothesis is. But I think he's going to come at it probably from a different perspective than many other people, and I really value that.
Yep, absolutely. Well, let's go and talk to Marcus.
Let's go.
So, Marcus, I think that Tim and I are kind of sold on the infinite enterprise. I mean, I have purchased my VR goggles. I'm all in. I'm ready to live digitally. Should I return them? Have I made a mistake?
I think I think there's probably an assumption that I don't buy into that's both a practical one, like will it happen, but also maybe a moral one as well. So I think, let me just start by saying there's a lot that Nabil and others have said that I definitely agree with. I mean, there's, clearly technology has changed our behavior for years before the pandemic, and, generations are experiencing technology different than, I'm almost 40, so different than I did, as a young adult or a youth. And then also the pandemic is obvious. So it's having an impact. And, I think there's certain industries that it's more clear to me that this probably doesn't affect them the same way. So, manufacturing and warehousing, I am struggling to see how those come to the home in an infinite and distributed way. Even medical, despite the fact that medical has been, severely impacted by the pandemic, I don't think that like the place that is a hospital or the services of medicine in a place are necessarily going to change the way that it was described before. But I think I'd almost prefer to start with education, because it's kind of right in the middle of something that seems like it's absolutely a part of this infinite experience. But I'm having a hard time seeing it even within education. So on one hand, there's no doubt that education has already sort of gone this way to this distributed experience. But it's also, to me, like the industry that is the best indicator, or will have the best indicators, that online experiences cannot replace in-person experiences in anywhere near an equivalent way, that we experience them in the flesh. And, the reason I say that is because education as an industry has these really clear indicators and KPIs that have been measured for a long time. And there's this sort of clear qualitative assessment that happens. And we haven't really had that since the pandemic started. And I think, for all administrators and educators that I've talked to and had conversations with, they're all frightened of what it's going to look like, when they start seeing these KPIs in a post-pandemic world, because they all know, we all know implicitly that what you do online just can't replace the experience that you can have in person. And so I think education is probably going to be sort of the first indicator of this. I saw on LinkedIn not too long ago, a friend of mine that was talking about broadband as sort of the great equalizer. And he was talking about it in the context of education, is these broadband programs that get every home connected. And I've sort of think of it the opposite way, which is that kids being in schools is the great equalizer. When you're at home, you're subject to all of the influences and capabilities of your home. And that includes your parents. I mean, not to insult anyone, but not all parents are equally capable or interested in, promoting education, and broadband doesn't sort of neutralize that. Being in school with equal access to influencers, educators, special help and all of that is the great equalizer.
It's interesting that you say that, Marcus, when, there's been a march towards technology in schools for a long time. And, there are online learning platforms, and obviously people are having to avail themselves of it now due to the pandemic. Do you feel that's either exposed some limitations in those platforms as we've gone into this through necessity? And do you think that will allow those platforms to get better, or for everybody to come running back into a physical experience?
I think the difference in the past has always been we use technology as an enablement tool. Like it enhances the education experience that you get, because there are online tools that you just, that you can't replace in person. But I think what we've accepted in the pandemic is technology replaces the in-person experience instead of enhancing it. So, even tools like Zoom, I sort of think of the technology in tiers. They're sort of like the network and audio video technology. And there's kind of like a minimum requirement to make remote learning even possible in the first place, which we have in the form of Zoom and other sort of collaboration tools. But there's no technology today that replaces the sensory experience, the augmented reality experience, the 360-degree experience that you get with extremely low latency that's needed for sort of the social interaction aspect that you just can't get. You can't replace that with technology today.
So just because we should, or just because we can, doesn't mean we should. Is sort of where you're going with that, it sounds.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, I would say technically speaking, we can't. You can't replace all elements of it. And because you can't, even if you could, but also because you can't, we shouldn't. There's another layer to this technology side that I think is interesting, which is the way that campuses, IT teams, security teams have treated network access and internet access within sort of a work or school environment in the past. And they've wanted to sort of control and regulate what you can and can't do, in terms of we don't want students going online and viewing pornography or violence or racism or whatever. I've kind of been thinking about this idea as online tools. They're going to wrestle with that same thing. And how much do you control, or can you control on platforms, collaboration platforms, what people see? You're not just inviting teachers into your home, you're inviting yourself into all of the other students' home. And so, that raises to me some questions about privacy, about security, about exposure, even about content filtering, the same way that you can with URL filtering on a network. How do you filter people's behavior on Zoom, whether it's through sort of computer vision and the way that you filter, or through sort of an audio approach to filtering out content that you don't want other students to hear? It's a little bit of a technical rabbit trail, but I think it's an interesting one, because you're not on the same campus anymore and you can't just control everything through one network. How do you facilitate those same protections? So yeah, it's kind of a technology layer that I think is interesting.
Well, we've talked about a lot in the last couple of minutes. So I do want to take a quick step back and just go, because we're going in a lot of really interesting directions. And I think one direction definitely is, Marcus, to your point about, if we're controlling and filtering what people are seeing, that also leads you to a question of, freedom of thought and creativity. And that also can stifle innovation. So that is one path to think about. I think the other thing, though, that I'm wondering as we're talking about this is, yes, there was a question about whether or not we shouldn't. But I also am wondering if you feel like you had said the technology that we have today definitely doesn't replace the human interaction. But do you think because of the pandemic that our technology will evolve to be able to maybe because of the pandemic, the technology has actually evolved faster because of it, and that we will get to that point someday, and then we'll have to define whether or not we should? Or are you saying you don't think the tech will ever get there?
Well, I don't think the tech will ever get there. Well, I should qualify. Like, we almost need to set some timelines here. I don't think the tech will be there in 50 years or less. But even within 50 years, like I think as we sort of push boundaries on the technology experience, you'll start to gain the possibility of sensory interactions, and audio video experiences will be, enhanced with, augmented or virtual realities. I mean, those things will happen. But I think with every step on the continuum of technology progress, you have to ask the same question. I mean, you already have to ask the question with social media, and you have to say, like, okay, well, social media is a form of socialization, but is it the same as hanging out with your friends or loved ones in person? And so, so every step of technology progress is going to give us more capabilities, but I don't think it's never going to replace the entire sensory experience of human life that you get in person. I don't think it ever will.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And then I think also the other question that we were kind of leaning towards that I really do want to explore is, how do you feel about hyper individualism? That's something that we have talked a lot about in the podcast so far. And you kind of touched on it. If you have all of these filters and you provide parameters in a certain world for people, is it helpful to be so hyper individualized? Or is it better that, sometimes you have to deal with the uncomfortable people, or like you have to be in an uncomfortable situation? I mean, do you think this is a good thing for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like with any technology, it's like there's a good version of it and there's a dangerous version of it. And I often see more of the dangerous versions of it, the hyper personalization. Like, I think people would argue that being online and the internet is sort of like a platform for diversity inclusion. But I would see the opposite thing, which is that people, when they go online, they're drawn towards affinities. They're drawn towards their hobbies and their passions and their interests, and they focus on those things. They're more likely to see other people that think like them and be reinforced in their thinking. Hyper-personalization is a confirmation bias. The way that all of these, ads and, promotions work with hyper-personalization is reinforce the thing that they already like, because that's the thing that they're most likely to click on. And so you're basically creating a worse environment in terms of like these social dynamics that we're trying to promote. I mean, and there's a lot of other layers to that, as it relates to sort of the way that confirmation bias affects, pride and the way that people interact in sort of what I would call like unjust or, socially poor ways. But then there's like a social isolation and a depression dynamic that happens here as well, that like if your only experience is online, gets a little bit dangerous.
Has social media given us a taste of what that looks like? In many ways, social media has become so prominent in our lives, almost as if the technology was advanced by the ability to hyper personalize in that way. It has become so ingrained into our society. Do you see any of that happening with the concept of the infinite enterprise, with some of the starting into that mindset and then actually augmenting that mindset, which could provide some more division?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of like a personal and a professional side to this that I kind of wrestle with. I mean, I think there's the personal side of it, which is like all social media sort of sets you up to, I don't know, I think of it as like a social choreography, is like you're kind of tailoring what you want to go out there, because you can control and filter, and you can sort of set up your life to look a certain way. There's a work side of this that I think is interesting too. Like, I mean, I joined Extreme right at the beginning of the pandemic, so in early 2020. And so my experience of it has pretty much been completely online. And, this feels a little bit like a confession, but it took me way longer to connect emotionally to the company as a result of that. There's no doubt in my mind. And, the way that I think about that is kind of, there's this interesting, I've made an observation. And so in the US, when we describe a company, we describe it as as a singular. So if we were to say like Extreme was, doing X, Y, Z, whereas in British English, they describe a company in a plural. So Extreme were doing X, Y, Z. And I think there's this sense of like, when you're a part of a company, you're not a part of an entity like a corporation, it's an it, but you're a part of a group of people, a collection of people. And so like when you join a company and you're a part of a company, I think that like sense of social dynamic has all of these different implications that we sort of like, we forget that like, just because technology can replace an experience, it's an inferior version of that same experience.
I think that's really interesting because I've had that same experience. I joined, I think, very close around the same time you did, and I've also gone through that. I've only experienced my work life in a virtual setting, so it's an interesting challenge. Is there a means by which online as we are today, so we're using the standard online tools versus a more immersive virtual experience, three-dimensional virtual experience. Is there a play there, or is it really still about pheromones and body expression in a room? Is that the key to the downfall of the concept, or is there a way for us to take online and move it into a
Yeah, I mean, I hate to be I love to be a contrarian, if I'm being honest, but honestly, I don't see any version of a virtual experience that replaces that in-person camaraderie that you get. I mean, I've worked from home for 10 plus years, so it's not like I'm opposed to like this remote distributed thing, but not getting together in person. So like my experience of this has been, even if I am just going to a conference and seeing the same people, my coworkers quarterly, or even once or twice a year for some of them, when you hang out and you share stories, there's a dynamic that happens in those spaces that you cannot recreate online because what happens online is sort of fixed and static in a certain way. I mean, even when you think about like day one at a company, if you're on a campus, someone walks you around and is like, hey, here's John and here's Bill and here's Sue and here's what they do. You might never have a meeting with them, but here's what they do. It's good to know that they're there. Here's what their face looks like. And then you kind of have some interaction. When you're online only, you never get that day one experience, first of all. And so then you never meet those same people unless you're in a meeting with them. So unless you have a shared interest. So it creates this sort of silo effect in a way that, like, I remember going to a conference a long time in Budapest, and we had an afternoon breakout where we went and, people could go wine tasting or drive go-karts or whatever. And the beauty of it wasn't the driving of go-karts. The beauty of it was you interact with people when you go and drive go-karts and you're goofing around. You interact with people that you wouldn't have interacted with in any other way. No one was ever going to set up a meeting between me and that person. But we rub shoulders, we share stories, you hear about their business, and these are like partners in my case, but you just there's a dynamic to in-person experiences that is, you just can't replace it online. There's no way to replace it online. That's my argument.
Does that reinforce the ability to continue online? So for example, you have that experience at a conference, or you meet every month or so in person. How does that affect your interactions with those people when you're online or in a virtual?
Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful point, which is, it almost takes like in-person camaraderie to make an online relationship really strong. And I would say that there's exceptions to that. I mean, there's people that you interact with online only that might be in your cohort of, or your coworkers, so your cohort or your group that you work with on a regular basis, and you click and connect and you build a relationship over time online. But again, like back to the sort of diversity, point in conversation. In a past world as a product manager, and I work with teams in Singapore, India, Taiwan, and online calls with them they were very difficult. If you go and visit them, you build relationships, you go out to dinner, you get to know their culture and who they are and what their personalities are like. And then when you're online in these meetings, it's much easier to joke. It's much easier to be loose and free in your conversations. And, there's a part of that I'm thinking from a personal perspective too, which is like, you want to appreciate like Indian culture, for example, go to India, taste the food, see the people, be in traffic, like that's a part of India, and it's all beautiful, but you almost have to experience it in order to really appreciate it. Like you can't get that by reading a book.
Yeah. So I think I totally agree with you. But then again, we're roughly about the same age. We're we're same millennial 1.0, right? And it's ingrained in us to go out and experience the world. I mean, we're the generation that invented FOMO and YOLO and, all of that. So I guess my question is, and I, have nieces and nephews who are going through this, and they're Generation Z, and they tell me, Auntie Carla, I don't care about seeing the world in person. I can experience it through Google. And for me, it was almost impossible for me to wrap my brain around that sort of view of the world of how could you not want to see it in person? And then I now think about, you take that mindset and you double down and you put them indoors and you say, now all of your experience is entirely virtual. How does that change that generation? I mean, I completely agree with you. I am also working remotely. I've mostly worked remotely with teams from all around the world. Working by myself is not unusual, but I like to go and meet them in person. That's very important to me. So I'm completely on board. But I think the generations behind us are going to have a completely different experience, and they might not feel like they need to see each other in person.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of have two minds on this. One side of me, I would say the emotion that I feel when you say that is actually lament. In there's this great quote. So it's like one of my favorite quotes. I hope I can do a quote on a podcast, but this author, Mark Buchanan, he kind of captured this, and the quote is this. He says, "If you describe a kiss in sheer physical terms, it sounds repulsive. Two people press their moist, creased facial orifices together, cinch tight the sphincter muscles to draw the flesh around the orifice into a bulbous mound, and exchange saliva and breath. And it takes imagination to transmute that into an act of intimacy and eroticism." And then he goes on to talk about stars, and you can describe them as rocks and gases and some of this kind of stuff. But it's like you're describing a kiss without ever actually experiencing one. And like, it's the lament that I feel is like, I think you're probably right. And I think that's the part of the infinite experience that probably will happen. But it seems to me that it's a trade. Like you're trading something that's like the human experience is deeply like sensory and it's tangible, and there's no way to replace that with this sort of like biological description of a kiss. I mean, it's the most beautiful sort of poetic capture of this problem, is like you just can't replace the full orbed experience of life online only. It's not possible.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is the first time we've said the word orifices on the podcast.
But it hasn't been edited out.
That hasn't been edited out. True. That isn't on the cutting room floor someplace. But I do agree with you. I think it will be inevitable that that can't be replaced. But I do maintain that. I do think it's going to be shades of gray. Maybe it's going to be more of our life is online and less of our life is in person. And I think it also means that as we experience more life online and virtually, that our society needs to make sure that we counterbalance with some way to actually have that pushback that we would receive in person, right? So I'm an extrovert, for example, and it has taken me a very long time to realize that actually alone time is a very good thing. It's probably a commentary about all the voices in my head, but I've had to learn that it's important for me to be pushed outside of that. And I think we're going to have to figure out ways to do that. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I love that point. I'm the opposite. I'm an introvert. Like if it's, a 1 to 10 scale where 10 is extremely introverted, I'm probably an 8. So I'm a pretty strong. So there's a part of me that's like, hey, I don't mind like pandemic life so much. I can handle this. But yeah, I think there's a good point there, which is that I think there's a part of human development that and there's tons of research. I mean, coming back to education, there's tons of research that shows the value that kids get by interacting in being forced to be in socially complex dynamics. And they build skills of observation, you build empathy, you build sort of all of these different muscles that we take for granted. the pandemic sort of online experience worked in part because I think we had this history of like in-person engagement, and we were able to like draw on that and then go online. So we had friend groups and community and, social clusters that we already had from our school experiences and work experiences and all of that. And you can draw on that. But a world that starts online only and stays online only, it never allows you to do that. And I think especially like personality is such a good like aspect to talk about this, because extroverts need, to be around introverts, and introverts, I mean, especially in my own experiences, like public speaking for me has been incredibly difficult, but it's been incredible for my personal like sense of like confidence in development, to actually be forced into situations where you're rubbing shoulders in difficult environments. And I think humans need that. And you just don't get that online. Again, you get the reinforcement of what you already like and know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and it would be up to the individual to opt in, right? It's the ultimate opt in to the human experience. Because I mean, I will be honest, the first time I heard about the infinite enterprise, I went, a hyper individualized world. No, I don't want that, because I'm one of those people that get sick of my own stuff. I want to have other experiences. I want to see other options, but that is part of who I am. And I can see, not everybody wants that. Everybody wants lots of people want the comfort zone. They want where they're going to be. And, I think it's really incumbent on the individual's human nature to opt in. Right. And that is really difficult to force.
And my hope is that we don't descend into a Morlocks and Eloy situation here, where the introverts and extroverts are, the introverts are below ground and the extroverts are above ground. But is there anything in the concept and the conceit of the infinite enterprise that you see can support or be a positive force for being able to maybe bring us together in a different way? Do you see, is there some positivity about the infinite enterprise that could work?
Is my silence a good enough answer for you? No, I'm really struggling with that. I mean, I personally would say the positive is I hope that people see that spending your life and your time online is actually more destructive in most cases. I don't think so. I would say this too. Some people are well equipped to do remote life quite well. And I would say probably more introverts than not, people that are self-motivated, people that are naturally very curious, because you overcome those sort of natural tendencies that being sort of closed in, I would call it, that it creates. There's a lot of people that aren't. And, I sort of have the same wrestle when it comes to like automation and robotics, is that like when you start displacing jobs and people become idle, even if you can say, hey, we'll give you money, people that are more idle, I think, are typically going to be destructive. People need to be productive and funneled towards something that's constructive, or they become destructive. And so I see it a little bit more that way, is like when you create too much space online in front of screens, and it's not like, oh, you look at a screen too long and your brain will rot. I think it's just the nature of like human activity, like that there's a connection between like what your purpose and your connection to mission and productivity and physical movement. Not for everyone, but I think it's just such a deep, like it's such, that idea is so deeply embedded in our physiology, in the way that we're made as people, that there's no way around it. I don't think.
Yeah. I think if we were going to do a glass half full version, I do think one thing, to your point, I think one thing, particularly as an extrovert, I have learned in this is how important it is to take care of myself, because I have to take care of myself. Right. And I do think that the flip side of potentially living in the infinite enterprise is it will allow for more self-awareness. There is the tendency, I think, for some people to potentially slide and just go with it and not ever challenge themselves. But there is something in our nature, as you said, that will force people to realize, hey, I need to maintain that physicality. I need to be active. I need to do this. And, there is a possibility that maybe as a human race, we will recognize that actually we need balance. We, as much as we can live online, we have to be in person as well. So it might balance itself out.
Yeah. I mean, I forgive my negativity. I think you're right. I mean, the pandemic has already proven that out, which is that people, when they can't socialize in the same way that they used to in, let's just call it public venues or public facilities, they get outdoors and they get more active in outdoor, sports and activities. And that to me is tremendous, like being connected to the natural world in different ways and appreciating the beauty of that. Like that's a huge win, I think, for people at large.
So in summary, Marcus, and I want to thank you so much for being on the show and being our person who to poke holes in this entire theory. Don't know if I'm going to unbox my VR goggles, but I will at least hold on. I don't know if I'm going to unbox them. I might return them. I'm not quite sure yet. You've made me think twice. But I think we've learned so much. And I think that you have definitely pointed out that while we might be prepared for the infinite enterprise, maybe technology might lead us there. There's a lot that has to be considered as we decide to move forward or not move forward with it.
Yeah. I mean, great summary. Thanks so much for having me. It's a lot of fun to be here and to work through this. I mean, there's so many layers to this conversation. Some of it absolutely is going to happen. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes and how technology makes all that happen or not happen possibly.
That's great. Thanks so much, Marcus. Carla, what I loved about listening to Marcus is that he's bringing an emotional perspective to this. This is really challenging to him on a level of a loss of human experience. We've stepped away from all the other guests that we've had where we talked about technology and the excitement of building new technologies and being able to deliver new experiences through technology. And we brought it back to a human experience. And Marcus had some really powerful thoughts on that. This is really about how we as humans react to these technology experiences. And, Marcus really challenged a lot of those thoughts.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me, it was very interesting because to your point, we have had a lot of technologists on the podcast. I think everybody has discussed, the opportunity and how exciting it is, which it is. It's very exciting. However, there has been a little thing in the back of my head going, what should we do this? I think we've learned from social media, there are upsides and downsides to technology. And, it's a double-edged sword always. And this is huge when you think about it in all of its instances, because there's potential for massive upside, massive freedom. But there is potential for some significant downside. And it was nice to have someone put a voice to that.
Right. It's very much we can do it, but should we? Right.
Yeah.
What is the impact? What is the response that we have? Marcus had a very powerful reference to a kiss, right? Which was powerful and graphic, but it indeed provided, a very strong way to look at how our experience is human to human versus, the dispassionate, if you will, view of technology or description. So his concept of still needing that experience, I think, is really important to take into account with the infinite enterprise. The infinite enterprise can enable us to have that very technological, very hyper-individualized experience. But there are some people who still want that personal experience. So there may be an element of how the infinite enterprise can support different ways of consuming. And I think that is a key element of the infinite enterprise. I think Marcus brought that out by showing that we can still have the ability to consume the infinite enterprise, but still have an emotional connection.
Well, and I think you make an interesting point here because, in that this is a red face test of our hypothesis as to whether or not the infinite enterprise will happen. And are we indeed going to change in some way permanently after the pandemic? He actually agreed. He agrees the infinite enterprise is likely to happen. And it's that we're not going to go back to the way that it was after the pandemic.
Yeah.
So, as far as challenging the idea, the fundamental of the idea. I think, we've got a bit of a win here in that, it seems that, Marcus is in alignment that it is going to change. Now, the question is to what degree, right? To what degree are people going to opt into the infinite enterprise?
Right.
Like Marcus might be like a 5%er, maybe 3.
Yeah, there was definitely a lament there. There was a I accept that this is happening. I lament the loss of some of the humanity. So yeah, I agree with you. He's probably a lower percentage of adopter of the entire concept, but he's just representative of one viewpoint. So there are so many out there who may fully adopt it, introverts versus extroverts. I'm somewhat more of an introvert myself, so I might consume the infinite enterprise in a significantly greater quantity than others.
Yeah. So, I think it just means it gives us freedom of choice, and that it, as with everything that we experience with technology and life in general, that it's going to be an opportunity for people to choose what's the best experience for them, which is, right back into hyper individualism. But, it gives a student the opportunity to be in the library on campus or to be out in the middle of Idaho on the library virtually, and having that same kind of experience in either instance.
Yeah, giving us the choice. I think that's really important. So the technology is enabling choice. It's not forcing us to consume in that way. It's allowing us to choose to consume in that way. And I think, or not just consume, but experience. Right? I think that's really valuable in the infinite enterprise, is that the technology is there. Use it how you see fit.
Exactly. Well, I think it's we can definitely say it's happening. It's changing. It's going now. We all need to figure out to which degree we're going to engage.
Right. And how we feel about it. I think that's great. So Marcus really gave us an opportunity to review and to consider. And I think we now have a stronger perspective of what the infinite enterprise can do for us and where the pitfalls may lie. Join us on the season finale of Inflection Points, where Carla and I discuss what we've learned on this journey, and we answer the really big question: is the infinite enterprise really a thing? If you'd like to find out more about the office of the CTO at Extreme Networks, find us on LinkedIn and check out the Extreme blog at www.extremenetworks.com.